Growing up, I always believed my sister Madison was older than me. She carried herself with the authority of an older sibling, made decisions for both of us, and reminded me constantly that she came first. For 23 years, I lived in her shadow, accepting that she had those extra months of life experience that somehow made her wiser, more responsible, more deserving of respect. But when I finally saw our hospital records side by side, everything I thought I knew about my family crumbled in an instant. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The discovery didn't happen by accident. It came during the worst week of my life, when both our parents lay in intensive care after a devastating car accident on Interstate 75 just outside Columbus, Ohio. Madison and I found ourselves thrust into the role of medical decision-makers, fumbling through paperwork and insurance forms while trying to process the possibility that we might lose both our parents in one tragic moment. My name is Jeanette Crawford, and this is the story of how a medical emergency revealed the biggest lie that had shaped my entire existence. Madison had always been the take-charge sister. Even as children in our suburban Cleveland home, she would wake up first, get dressed first, and march downstairs to announce what we would be having for breakfast. She chose our matching outfits for family photos, decided which movies we would watch during our weekend sleepovers, and somehow always managed to claim the front seat in our mother's minivan before I could even reach for the door handle. "I'm older, Jeanette," she would say, with that matter-of-fact tone that left no room for argument. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Parents don't lie about something as basic as birth order, and Madison seemed to have this natural confidence that I simply lacked. She was taller by 2 inches, spoke with more authority, and had this way of making me feel like the little sister, even though we were supposedly only 4 months apart. Our parents, David and Linda Crawford, never corrected this assumption. If anything, they seemed to reinforce it. During family gatherings, relatives would always greet Madison first, comment on how mature she looked for her age, and then turn to me with that slightly patronizing smile reserved for younger siblings. Madison would accept the attention gracefully, while I stood awkwardly beside her, waiting for my turn to be acknowledged. The 4-month age gap became the explanation for everything. When Madison scored higher on standardized tests, it was because she was older. When she got her driver's license first, it was because she was older. When she landed her first job at the local movie theater while I was still struggling with job applications, everyone nodded knowingly. Of course, the older sister would be more responsible, more mature, more ready for adult responsibilities. Even our physical development seemed to support this narrative. Madison hit puberty earlier, grew taller faster, and developed the kind of poise that made people assume she was the responsible one. I remained shorter, quieter, and somehow always felt like I was playing catch-up in a race where the finish line kept moving further away. The dynamic followed us into adulthood. Madison graduated from Ohio State University a semester early with a degree in business administration and immediately landed a position at a marketing firm in downtown Cleveland. I struggled through my communications program, changed majors twice, and eventually graduated with decent grades but no clear career direction. Madison bought her first car with cash she had saved from working multiple part-time jobs throughout college. I borrowed money from our parents for a used Honda that broke down every few months. "Don't worry, Jeanette," Madison would say during our weekly phone calls after we had both moved into our own apartments. "Everyone develops at their own pace. You'll figure it out eventually." Her condescending kindness stung worse than outright criticism. She had this way of offering advice that made me feel simultaneously grateful and inadequate, like she was doing me a favor by sharing her older sister wisdom with someone who clearly needed guidance. The pattern continued through our early 20s. Madison got promoted twice in 3 years, while I cycled through entry-level positions, never quite finding my footing in any particular field. She started dating Kevin Martinez, a software engineer she met at a professional networking event, and their relationship progressed with the kind of steady maturity that made our parents beam with pride. My romantic life consisted of a series of awkward coffee dates and short-lived relationships that fizzled out before reaching any meaningful level of commitment. During family dinners at our childhood home on Maple Street, Madison would update everyone on her latest achievements while I listened and picked at my food. She had joined a professional women's organization, completed a certification program in digital marketing, and was already talking about saving for a down payment on a house. I had recently been passed over for a promotion at the nonprofit where I worked as a communications assistant and was still living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment with thin walls and unreliable heating. Madison has always been so driven, our mother would say, clearing the dinner plates while Madison helped organize the leftovers with efficient precision. She gets that from me, I think, always planning ahead, thinking about the future. The implication was clear. I was the dreamer, the one who needed more time to mature, the younger sister who would eventually catch up but might need a little more patience and guidance along the way. And I accepted this role because it was the only identity I had ever known. But there were moments, small inconsistencies that nagged at the back of my mind, like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. Sometimes when our mother would tell stories about our early childhood, the details didn't quite align with Madison being born first. She would mention how I had slept through the night earlier than Madison, how I had reached certain developmental milestones first, how the pediatrician had commented on my advanced verbal skills during our shared appointments. "Jeanette was such an easy baby," she would say, then quickly add, "But Madison was more alert, more aware of her surroundings. She seemed to understand everything that was happening around her." These comments always felt like corrections, like our mother was working to maintain a narrative that required constant reinforcement. But I dismissed my doubts as the insecurity of a younger sister who wanted to believe she was somehow special, somehow more important than her birth order suggested. Madison never showed any uncertainty about our family hierarchy. She would reference being born first with casual confidence, mentioning how she remembered things I was supposedly too young to understand, how she had always felt protective of her little sister. She had this way of claiming memories and experiences that made me question my own recollections. "Remember when we got lost at the shopping mall when we were 5?" she would say during one of our nostalgic conversations. "I was the one who found the security guard and got us back to Mom and Dad. You were too scared to talk to strangers." But I did remember that day, and my memory was different. I remembered being the one who approached the security guard, remembering Madison clinging to my hand while I explained that we couldn't find our parents. But when Madison told the story with such conviction, I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was remembering it wrong. Maybe I had confused my own memories with hers, the way young children sometimes do. The doubt became a constant companion, making me question not just specific memories, but my entire sense of self. If I couldn't trust my own recollections about something as simple as getting lost in a mall, how could I trust anything else? Maybe Madison really was more mature, more capable, more deserving of the respect that seemed to come so naturally to her. Looking back now, I can see how the lie shaped every decision I made, every relationship I formed, every opportunity I either seized or let slip away. I lived my life as the younger sister, accepting limitations that were never really mine to accept, deferring to authority that was never really legitimate, believing in a hierarchy that existed only because we all agreed to pretend it was real. The truth was hiding in plain sight, waiting in hospital records and birth certificates that none of us had ever thought to examine closely. But it would take a crisis, the worst kind of crisis, to finally bring it to light. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I know the exact time because I stared at my phone's glowing screen for several seconds before my brain could process what the voice on the other end was telling me. A drunk driver had crossed the median on Interstate 75, colliding head-on with our parents' silver Toyota Camry as they drove home from their anniversary dinner at Giovanni's Italian restaurant. Madison lived closer to Cleveland General Hospital, so she arrived 20 minutes before I did. When I finally burst through the automatic doors of the emergency department, my hair still messy from sleep and my jacket thrown over pajama pants, she was already deep in conversation with Dr. Sarah Peterson, the trauma surgeon handling our parents' cases. "Jeanette, thank God you're here," Madison said, grabbing my arm with hands that were visibly shaking. For the first time in our adult lives, she looked genuinely scared. Her usual composure cracked wide open by the magnitude of what we were facing. Dad has internal bleeding and they need to operate immediately. Mom has a severe head injury and they're running more tests. Dr. Peterson explained the situation with the kind of clinical detachment that medical professionals use to deliver devastating news. Our father's spleen had ruptured, and he needed emergency surgery within the hour. Our mother had sustained a traumatic brain injury and was currently unconscious, her condition listed as critical but stable. Both of them would likely survive, but the next 48 hours would determine the extent of permanent damage. Dr. Peterson continued, consulting her clipboard, and we'll need medical power of attorney information, and we'll need complete medical histories for both patients. Any family history of heart disease, diabetes, blood clotting disorders, allergies to medications, everything you can provide will help us make the best treatment decisions. Madison immediately took charge, pulling out her phone to access the family documents stored in her cloud account. She had always been the organized one, the sister who kept digital copies of important paperwork and maintained detailed records of everything. I felt grateful for her efficiency, even as I stood there feeling useless and overwhelmed. I have copies of their insurance cards and some medical information, Madison said, scrolling through her files, but we might need to go to their house to get the complete records. They keep everything in the filing cabinet in Dad's home office. The next few hours passed in a blur of waiting rooms, vending machine coffee, and hushed conversations with medical staff. Dad's surgery went well. The surgeon was able to repair the internal bleeding and stabilize his condition. Mom remained unconscious, but showed positive responses to neurological tests. We weren't out of the woods, but the immediate crisis had passed. As dawn broke over Cleveland, pale light through the hospital's floor-to-ceiling windows, Madison and I found ourselves alone in the family consultation room. We had called in sick to our respective jobs, canceled all our plans, and settled in for what would clearly be an extended stay at the hospital. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. We should probably go get those medical files, Madison said, rubbing her eyes with the heels of her hands. The doctors are going to need detailed information about allergies, previous surgeries, medications they've taken. You know how thorough Mom and Dad are about keeping records. Our parents' house felt strange and quiet when we let ourselves in using Madison's spare key. The breakfast dishes were still in the sink from yesterday morning, and Dad's reading glasses sat folded on the kitchen counter next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Everything looked exactly as they had left it before driving to their anniversary dinner, completely unaware that their lives were about to be permanently altered by one drunk driver's devastating choice. The filing cabinet in Dad's home office was a masterpiece of organization, with neatly labeled folders containing decades of financial documents, tax returns, insurance policies, and medical records. Madison and I worked methodically through the files, pulling out anything that might be relevant to the doctor's questions. "Here's Mom's folder," Madison said, handing me a thick manila envelope. "And here's Dad's. They even have copies of their childhood vaccination records. Mom must have gotten these from Grandma years ago." I was flipping through Mom's medical history when I noticed a folder labeled Children, Medical Records, tucked behind the adult files. Inside were our childhood immunization records, pediatrician visit summaries, and copies of our birth certificates that our parents had apparently requested for various purposes over the years. "Look at this," I said, pulling out the documents. "They kept copies of everything. This might help if the doctors need information about genetic factors or family medical history." Madison glanced over as I spread the papers across Dad's desk. Our birth certificates were right on top, official documents from Franklin County, Ohio, with raised seals and formal typography that made them look important and authoritative. That's when I saw it. My birth certificate showed a date and time, April 15th, 1999, at 3:22 a.m. Madison's show, April 15th, 1999, at 7:45 a.m. I stared at the documents for a long moment, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. According to these official records, I had been born 4 hours and 23 minutes before Madison, not 4 months after, 4 hours before. Madison, I said, my voice coming out as barely a whisper, look at these birth certificates. She leaned over my shoulder, and I heard her sharp intake of breath as she saw the same information that had just turned my entire understanding of our family upside down. That can't be right, she said, grabbing her birth certificate and studying it closely. These must be copies of copies or something. Maybe there was a clerical error when Dad requested them. But even as she spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. The documents looked legitimate, with official seals and signatures that would be nearly impossible to fake. More importantly, they both showed the same parents, the same hospital, the same date, just different times. We were born on the same day, I said, still trying to wrap my head around this revelation. We're twins, Madison. We're twins, and I was born first. The silence that followed was deafening. Madison stared at the birth certificates as if she could will them to change, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked almost like panic. "This doesn't make sense," she finally said. "Mom and Dad always said I was born in February, and you were born in June. They said there were 4 months between us. They've been saying that our entire lives." I picked up my birth certificate again, examining every detail. Franklin County Hospital, Columbus, Ohio, baby girl Crawford, born to David Michael Crawford and Linda Susan Crawford. April 15th, 1999, 3:22 a.m. Weight, 6 pounds, 4 ounces. Length, 19 inches. Madison's certificate was identical, except for the time, 7:45 a.m., and slightly different measurements. She had been smaller at birth, weighing 5 pounds, 11 ounces and measuring 18 inches long. "We need to call Mom and Dad," Madison said, but even as she spoke, we both realized how impossible that was. Our parents were lying unconscious in hospital beds, fighting for their lives. This conversation would have to wait. "Maybe there's more information in their files," I suggested, turning back to the filing cabinet with new urgency. "Maybe there's an explanation for why they told us we were born months apart." We searched through every folder, every envelope, every loose paper in that cabinet. We found our hospital bracelets from birth, saved in a small jewelry box that Mom had apparently kept as mementos. We found our first baby photos, taken in the hospital nursery and clearly labeled with the same date. We found insurance forms from 1999 that listed both of us as dependents born on April 15th. Every piece of documentation told the same story. Madison and I were twins, born hours apart on the same day, and I had come first. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was a handwritten note in our mother's careful script, tucked inside a sympathy card from when my maternal grandmother had passed away 3 years earlier. The note appeared to be a rough draft of something, with crossed-out words and revised sentences. The hardest part about losing Mom is knowing that she took our secret with her. She was the only one who understood why we made the choice we did about the girls. She supported our decision to tell them they were born months apart instead of hours apart. She knew how difficult it was for us to watch Madison struggle with being the smaller, weaker twin, and she agreed that giving her the identity of the older sister might help her confidence. The note was incomplete, apparently abandoned mid-thought, but the implications were staggering. Our parents had deliberately lied about our birth order, not through some accident or misunderstanding, but as a conscious decision to help Madison feel more confident and secure. As Madison read the note over my shoulder, I watched 23 years of certainty crumble in her expression. Everything she had built her identity around, her role as the older, more responsible sister, had been constructed on a foundation of lies designed to protect her from the supposed trauma of being born second. The irony was devastating. In trying to boost Madison's confidence by making her the older sister, our parents had systematically undermined mine, making me believe I was younger, less capable, less deserving of respect and authority. "Janeth," Madison said finally, her voice barely audible, "I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea." But as I looked at her face, I wasn't sure I believed her. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I cared what my sister thought about anything.
The drive back to Cleveland General Hospital was the longest 20-minute ride of my life. Madison sat in the passenger seat of my Honda, clutching the birth certificates and our mother's unfinished note, while I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Neither of us spoke, but I could feel the weight of 23 years of deception pressing down on us like a physical force. When we walked back into the ICU waiting area, everything looked exactly the same as when we had left 2 hours earlier. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the same daytime television played quietly in the corner, the same antiseptic smell filled the air. But I felt like a completely different person than the one who had walked out of this hospital to retrieve medical records for our injured parents. Dr. Peterson approached us with an update on our parents' conditions. Dad was awake and responsive following his surgery, though still heavily sedated and unable to have visitors for another few hours. Mom remained unconscious, but stable, with brain scans showing encouraging signs of reduced swelling. "We should be able to give you a better prognosis by this evening," Dr. Peterson explained. "In the meantime, did you find those medical records we discussed?" Madison handed over the relevant health documents, while I stood silently beside her, still processing the magnitude of what we had discovered. The irony wasn't lost on me, that we were here because our parents needed medical care, and their medical emergency had revealed the biggest medical lie of our lives. Once Dr. Peterson left to review the files, Madison and I found ourselves alone again in the consultation room. She kept looking at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between guilt and genuine confusion that made me wonder how much she really knew about our family's deception. "We need to talk about this," I said, settling into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs that lined the room's perimeter. Madison sat across from me, still holding our birth certificates like they might spontaneously change if she stared at them long enough. "I honestly don't understand any of this, Janeth. I remember being told I was older. I remember Mom and Dad celebrating my birthday in February and yours in June. I have memories of birthday parties, of presents, of feeling special because I got to celebrate first." Her words hit me like a slap. While she was remembering feeling special about being older, I was remembering the sting of always being second, always waiting my turn, always being reminded that Madison got privileges because she was born first. The contrast was painful and infuriating. "But those memories don't make sense now," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "According to these documents, we were born hours apart, not months. We should have shared birthday parties. We should have blown out candles on the same cake." Madison was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the birth certificates. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. "There are things that never quite made sense to me either. Like why we were in all the same classes at school if I was supposed to be 4 months older. Why do we hit all the same developmental milestones at the same time? Why people would sometimes look confused when Mom or Dad mentioned our age difference." I remembered those moments too, but from a different perspective. I had always assumed people were confused because Madison and I looked so much alike, or because the age gap wasn't immediately obvious in our appearance. It had never occurred to me that people were confused because our parents' stories simply didn't add up. "Do you think our teachers knew?" I asked. "Our pediatrician? Other family members?"
Madison shook her head slowly. "I think about Aunt Carol and how she would always give us identical gifts for our supposed separate birthdays. I thought she was just being practical, but maybe she knew something we didn't. Maybe a lot of people knew something we didn't." The more we talked, the more the elaborate nature of our parents' deception became clear. They hadn't just lied about our birth dates, they had constructed an entire fictional timeline, complete with fake birthday celebrations, age-appropriate gifts given months apart, and constant reinforcement of a hierarchy that had never actually existed. "Why would they do this to us?" I asked, though I suspected the answer was in our mother's unfinished note. "Why go to such lengths to make you think you were older and me think I was younger?" Madison looked up from the birth certificates, and I saw tears forming in her eyes for the first time since we had arrived at the hospital. The note said something about me being smaller and weaker. Maybe I was sick when we were born? Maybe there were complications? I thought about the weight and length measurements on our birth certificates. Madison had been noticeably smaller, nearly half a pound lighter and an inch shorter. In the context of twin births, that could be significant. Maybe she had needed extra medical attention or had struggled in ways that made our parents worry about her confidence and development. Even if that's true, I said, feeling my anger resurface, that doesn't justify lying to us for our entire lives. That doesn't justify making me believe I was less important, less capable, less deserving of respect because I was supposedly younger. The words came out more forcefully than I had intended, and Madison flinched as if I had physically struck her. But I wasn't finished. 23 years of suppressed feelings were finally finding their voice. Do you have any idea what it was like, Madison? Always being second, always being the little sister who needed guidance and patience? Watching you get promoted while I struggled? Seeing you buy a house while I could barely afford rent? Listening to everyone praise your maturity while treating me like I just needed more time to catch up? Madison was crying openly now, mascara streaking down her cheeks and dark lines. I didn't know, Janess. I swear I didn't know any of this. I thought I really was older. I thought I really did have more experience and wisdom to share with you. But did you ever question it? I pressed. Did you ever wonder why the age difference didn't seem to matter in school? Or why we developed at exactly the same rate? Or why I seemed to understand things just as well as you did despite supposedly being months younger? She was quiet for a long time, wiping her eyes with tissues from the box on the consultation room table. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. I think I did question it sometimes, but I pushed those thoughts away because I liked being the older sister. I liked feeling important and responsible. I liked having people look up to me and ask for my advice. I liked being the one who took care of things. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. I'm sorry, Janeth. I'm so sorry. Her apology felt simultaneously genuine and inadequate. How do you apologize for 23 years of accepting privileges that were never rightfully yours? How do you make amends for a lifetime of condescension and assumed authority that was built on a lie? I need to understand the full extent of this, I said, standing up and beginning to pace around the small room. I need to know who else knew, how long this has been going on, and what other lies our family has been built on. Madison nodded, still crying but trying to compose herself. What do you want to do? Do we confront Mom and Dad when they wake up? Do we tell other family members? Do we just pretend we never found out? The last option was tempting in its simplicity. We could put the birth certificates back in Dad's filing cabinet, pretend this conversation never happened, and continue living the roles we had always played. Madison could remain the older, wiser sister, and I could continue accepting my place as the younger sibling who needed guidance and patience. But the thought of returning to that dynamic made me physically sick. Now that I knew the truth, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't go back to deferring to Madison's authority or accepting her advice as if she had some inherent wisdom that came from being born first. I couldn't pretend that her accomplishments were more impressive because she was older, or that my struggles were more understandable because I was younger. We're going to confront them, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. When Mom and Dad are well enough to have this conversation, we're going to ask them to explain themselves. We're going to find out who else knew about this lie and why they thought it was acceptable to deceive us for our entire lives. Madison looked scared, and for the first time, I didn't feel compelled to comfort her or make her feel better about an uncomfortable situation. She had benefited from this deception for 23 years, even if she hadn't been consciously aware of it. She had received praise, respect, and opportunities that might have been different if people had known the truth about our birth order. What if this ruins our family? Madison asked. What if Mom and Dad can't handle being confronted about this while they're recovering from their injuries? What if living with this lie ruins us? I countered. What if I spend the rest of my life knowing that every interaction we've had, every family dynamic we've experienced, every assumption people have made about us has been based on a deliberate deception? As if summoned by our conversation, Dr. Peterson appeared in the doorway of the consultation room. "Your father is awake and asking for you both," she said. "He's still weak and will need to rest frequently, but he's alert and able to have short conversations." Madison and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Dad was awake and coherent, which meant we could finally get answers to the questions that were tearing our family apart. The confrontation we had been planning for when our parents recovered was about to happen much sooner than expected. I picked up our birth certificates from the table and tucked them into my purse. It was time to find out just how deep this deception went and what other truths our parents had been hiding from us all these years. Walking into Dad's hospital room felt like approaching the edge of a cliff. He looked smaller than I remembered, dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding his bed and the network of tubes connecting him to various monitors. His face was pale and drawn, with deep purple bruises around his left eye and a bandage covering stitches along his hairline. When he saw us enter, his expression brightened with relief. "My girls," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Thank God you're both safe. I was so worried about you when I woke up and didn't know where you were." Madison immediately went to his bedside and took his hand, falling back into her familiar role as the caring, responsible daughter. "We're fine, Dad. We've been here all night, waiting for you to wake up. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Dad said with a weak smile. "Though I suppose that's not far from the truth. How's your mother? The nurses won't tell me much, and I've been going crazy not knowing if she's okay." I hung back near the door, clutching my purse where our birth certificates were hidden, watching this tender family reunion while feeling like an outsider in my own life. Everything about this interaction felt different now that I knew the truth. Dad's concerned questions, Madison's immediate rush to comfort him, even the way he called us "my girls." It all felt tainted by the knowledge of their massive deception. "Mom is stable," I said, finally joining the conversation. "She's still unconscious, but the doctors say our brain scans are improving. They think she'll make a full recovery, but it might take some time." Dad closed his eyes and let out a long breath of relief. "That's the best news I've heard since I woke up. I keep replaying that moment when I saw the headlights coming toward us. I thought we might not make it home to see you girls again." The raw emotion in his voice almost made me reconsider what I was about to do. Here was my father, injured and vulnerable, expressing gratitude just to be alive and see his daughters. Confronting him about a 23-year-old lie while he was recovering from surgery felt cruel and unnecessary. But then I looked at Madison, who was stroking Dad's hand and murmuring reassurances, and I remembered all the years she had done exactly this, positioned herself as the primary caregiver, the responsible one, the daughter who naturally took charge in crisis situations. How much of that dynamic was real, and how much was the result of everyone believing she was the older, more mature sister? "Dad," I said, my voice sounding strangely formal in the intimate hospital room setting, "we found something when we went to get your medical records, something we need to talk about." He looked confused by my tone, his eyes moving between Madison and me, as if trying to read the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "What kind of something? Did we forget to update an insurance form or miss a payment somewhere?" Madison shot me a warning look, shaking her head slightly, as if to say this wasn't the right time or place. But I had spent too many years letting Madison dictate when and how important conversations would happen. I wasn't going to defer to her judgment anymore. "We found our birth certificates," I said, pulling the documents from my purse. "Both of them. And they tell a very different story than what you and Mom have been telling us our entire lives." The change in Dad's expression was immediate and unmistakable. The confusion disappeared, replaced by something that looked like panic mixed with resignation. He didn't ask what I meant or express surprise about what we might have discovered. He simply closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the pillow. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, God. I hoped this day would never come." His reaction was confirmation enough, but I pressed forward anyway. "According to these official documents, Madison and I are twins. We were born on the same day, April 15th, 1999, and I was born first. Not 4 months later, Dad, 4 hours earlier." Madison was staring at our father with an expression of desperate hope,
as if she was still clinging to the possibility that this was all some massive misunderstanding that he would quickly explain away. But Dad opened his eyes and looked directly at me, and I saw 23 years of guilt and regret reflected in his gaze. The birth certificates are correct, Madison. Janeth was born first. You're twins, and we've been lying to you about it since the day you came home from the hospital. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, making the room feel smaller and more suffocating. Madison made a small sound that was part gasp, part sob, while I felt a strange mixture of vindication and devastation. I had been right about the documents, but being right about such a fundamental deception didn't feel like victory. Why? I asked, my voice barely controlled. Why would you do this to us? Why would you create an elaborate lie about something as basic as when we were born? Dad was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the ceiling tiles above his bed. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with an exhaustion that seemed to go far beyond his physical injuries.
Madison almost died during delivery, he said quietly. She was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, and she wasn't breathing. The doctors worked on her for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. When she finally started breathing, she was so much smaller and weaker than you were. You came out screaming and healthy, but Madison spent the first week of her life in the NICU. Madison was crying again, but silently this time, tears streaming down her face as she continued to hold Dad's hand. I found myself feeling a complicated mix of emotions: sympathy for what my sister had gone through as a newborn, anger at being kept in the dark about something so significant, and confusion about how any of this justified the lie. "That still doesn't explain why you lied about our birth order," I said. "Lots of twins have different birth experiences. Lots of families deal with medical complications without rewriting their children's entire identities." Dad turned his head to look at me directly, and I saw something in his expression that I recognized. The same look Madison had worn countless times when she was about to explain why she knew better than me, why her way was the right way, why I needed to trust her judgment. "When you girls were about 2 years old, Madison started showing signs of developmental delays," he continued. "She was smaller than you, quieter, less confident. She would cry when other children tried to play with her, and she seemed afraid of everything. The pediatrician said it might be related to her difficult birth, or it might just be her personality, but your mother and I were worried." "So you decided to make her the older sister?" I asked, incredulous. "You thought giving her a fake 4-month head start would solve her confidence problems?" "We thought it might help her feel more secure," Dad said defensively. "We thought if people expected her to be the mature one, the responsible one, she might rise to meet those expectations. And we thought it would give her an advantage socially. Older siblings often have more confidence and leadership skills." The logic was so twisted and misguided that I almost laughed. Instead of addressing Madison's actual needs or getting her appropriate help for her developmental delays, they had decided to rebuild our entire family structure around a lie designed to boost her self-esteem at my expense. "What about me?" I asked. "What about my confidence and leadership skills? What about the message you were sending by making me believe I was younger and less capable?" Dad looked uncomfortable, shifting in his hospital bed, despite the obvious pain the movement caused. "You were always so strong, Janeth, so independent and self-assured. We thought you could handle being the younger sister. We thought it wouldn't affect you the same way." "You thought wrong," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You had no right to make that decision for either of us. You had no right to steal 4 hours of my life and give them to Madison just because you thought she needed the advantage more than I did." "Janeth, please," Madison said, speaking for the first time since Dad had confirmed the truth. "He's hurt, and he's trying to explain. Can't we just be grateful that we know the truth now?" But I was beyond being reasonable or grateful. 23 years of suppressed anger and resentment were finally finding their voice, and I wasn't going to be silenced by appeals to family harmony or concerns about Dad's medical condition. "No, Madison, we can't just be grateful," I snapped.
We can't just pretend this is some minor family secret that doesn't matter anymore. This lie shaped everything about our lives, our relationships with each other, with our parents, with everyone who knows our family. People have been treating you with extra respect and me with extra patience for our entire lives based on information that was completely false. Dad closed his eyes again, looking older and more frail than I had ever seen him. I know we made a mistake. Your mother and I have talked about telling you the truth so many times over the years, but the longer we waited, the harder it became. How do you tell your adult children that their entire childhood was built on a lie? You tell them the truth, I said simply. You tell them the truth and you deal with the consequences, no matter how difficult they might be. The heart monitor next to Dad's bed was beeping faster now, and I realized that our confrontation was putting additional stress on someone who was supposed to be resting and recovering. But I wasn't finished with this conversation, and I wasn't going to let medical concerns silence me the way I had been silenced for my entire life. Who else knew? I asked. Mom obviously knew, but what about other family members? Our teachers? Family friends?
Dad sighed heavily. Your grandmother knew. Aunt Carol figured it out when you girls were in elementary school. A few close family friends knew, but we asked them not to say anything. Most people just accepted what we told them without questioning it. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Multiple adults had known the truth about our birth order and had chosen to maintain the lie rather than advocate for honesty. They had watched me struggle with feelings of inadequacy and watched Madison benefit from unearned authority, and none of them had spoken up. This conversation isn't over, I said, gathering up the birth certificates and putting them back in my purse. When Mom wakes up, we're going to have this discussion again, and this time, I want to hear from both of you about how you plan to make this right. As I turned to leave the hospital room, I heard Madison call my name, but I didn't stop. I had spent 23 years stopping when Madison called, deferring to her wishes, accepting her authority. Those days were over, and it was time for me to figure out who I really was when I wasn't living in the shadow of a lie. I spent the next 3 hours sitting alone in my car in the hospital parking garage, staring at the concrete wall in front of me while my phone buzzed incessantly with text messages from Madison. She was alternating between apologies, pleas for me to come back upstairs, and updates about Dad's condition that I couldn't bring myself to care about. The man who had just confessed to orchestrating a 23-year deception was concerned about his heart rate? The irony wasn't lost on me. When I finally looked at my phone, there were 17 missed calls and 24 text messages. Madison's desperation was palpable even through the digital medium, but reading her messages only made me angrier. She was still trying to manage the situation, still trying to control the narrative and smooth over the family crisis. Even now, in the face of irrefutable evidence that her authority was built on lies, she was attempting to guide my reaction and dictate how we should handle this revelation. Janeth, please come back. Dad is asking for you, and his vitals are elevated. We need to present a united front as a family right now. I know you're upset, but we can work through this together. Fighting isn't going to change what happened. Can we please just focus on getting Mom and Dad healthy before we deal with the birthday thing? This isn't the right time for family drama. The birthday thing. As if 23 years of systematic deception could be reduced to a minor scheduling mix-up. As if my entire sense of identity being built on a lie was just family drama that needed to be managed with appropriate timing and sensitivity. I turned off my phone and drove home to my studio apartment, needing space to process everything without Madison's constant attempts to orchestrate my emotional response. For the first time in my adult life, I was making a decision without considering what my supposedly older sister thought was best. My apartment felt different when I walked through the door. The same cramped space, the same secondhand furniture, the same view of the parking lot through windows that didn't quite close properly. But now, I saw it through different eyes. This wasn't the apartment of someone who was still figuring things out, still catching up to where she should be at 23. This was the apartment of someone who had been systematically undermined and held back by people who were supposed to love and support her. I pulled out a bottle of wine that I had been saving for a special occasion and poured myself a generous glass. If discovering that your entire life was built on a lie, nothing would. As I sat on my couch with my wine and finally allowed myself to truly think about what I had learned, the full scope of the betrayal began to sink in. This wasn't just about birth order or family dynamics. This was about agency, identity, and the fundamental right to know the truth about your own existence. Every major decision I had made in my adult life had been influenced by the belief that I was the younger, less experienced sister. I had chosen a less competitive college because I didn't think I was ready for the academic rigor that Madison could handle. I had accepted lower-paying jobs because I thought I needed more time to develop the skills and confidence that came naturally to older siblings. I had deferred to Madison's advice about career choices, relationship decisions, and financial planning because I believed she had inherent wisdom that I lacked. How different might my life have been if I had known the truth? If I had understood that I was actually 4 hours older than Madison, that any differences in our development were not related to age but to individual personality and circumstances. If I had been raised with the confidence that comes from being the firstborn instead of the insecurity that comes from always being second. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just at my parents, though their betrayal was the foundation of everything else. I was angry at every teacher who had praised Madison's maturity while telling me I just needed more time to catch up. I was angry at every relative who had given Madison leadership roles in family gatherings while treating me like the little sister who needed guidance. I was angry at every friend who had assumed Madison was more responsible and capable based solely on the supposed 4-month age difference. But most of all, I was angry at Madison herself. Even if she hadn't consciously known about the deception, she had benefited from it every single day for 23 years. She had accepted praise, respect, and opportunities that were rightfully mine. She had built her entire identity around being the older, wiser sister.
And she had never once questioned whether she deserved that status. My phone had been buzzing intermittently on the coffee table, but I had been ignoring it. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I turned it back on to find 3 voicemails and a dozen new text messages. One of the voicemails was from Madison, her voice shaky and tearful as she begged me to come back to the hospital. But the other 2 were from numbers I didn't recognize. The first was from Dr. Peterson, calling to inform me that my mother had regained consciousness and was asking for both her daughters. My initial impulse was relief. Mom was awake and alert, which meant the worst of the medical crisis had passed. But my second thought was dread. If Mom was conscious, it meant the conversation about our birth order was about to get much more complicated. The second voicemail was from someone who identified herself as Patricia Williams, a social worker at Cleveland General Hospital. She was calling because there had been some kind of incident in my father's room after I left, and the medical staff was concerned about the family dynamics affecting his recovery. She asked me to call her back as soon as possible to discuss what she diplomatically referred to as family counseling resources. Apparently, my confrontation with Dad had caused enough of a disruption that the hospital staff felt the need to intervene. Part of me felt guilty about potentially jeopardizing his recovery, but a larger part of me was frustrated that even now, in the middle of the biggest crisis of our family's history, I was somehow being positioned as the problem child who needed to be managed and controlled. I poured myself another glass of wine and called the social worker back. Patricia Williams had a kind but professional voice, and she explained that Dad's blood pressure had spiked significantly after our conversation, requiring additional medication and monitoring. She wasn't blaming me directly, but she strongly suggested that any further family discussions be postponed until his condition was more stable. I understand that families often face difficult conversations during medical crises, she said carefully, but sometimes it's helpful to have a neutral third party facilitate those discussions, especially when there are long-standing issues that need to be resolved. Long-standing issues, as if a 23-year conspiracy was just a communication problem that could be solved with family therapy and guided dialogue. Has my sister mentioned anything about the nature of our family conflict? I asked, wondering how much Madison had revealed to the hospital staff. She indicated that there had been some discoveries about family history that were causing distress, Patricia said diplomatically. She seemed very concerned about maintaining family unity during this difficult time. Of course she was. Madison was probably spinning this as a minor misunderstanding that could be resolved if everyone just remained calm and reasonable. She was probably positioning herself as the mature, responsible family member, trying to hold everything together while her emotionally unstable younger sister caused unnecessary drama. Except I wasn't the younger sister. I was 4 hours older than Madison, and I was done being managed and controlled by someone whose authority was built entirely on lies. I appreciate your concern, I told Patricia, but this is a family matter that we need to resolve ourselves. I'll be back to the hospital tomorrow to visit my mother, and I'll make sure any conversations I have with my father are appropriate for his medical condition. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment and tried to figure out what I wanted to do next. The rational part of my brain said I should go back to the hospital, apologize for upsetting Dad, and work with Madison to present a united front while our parents recovered. The angry part of my brain said I should cut contact with my entire family and let them deal with the consequences of their deception. But there was a third option that was becoming more appealing with each glass of wine. I could take control of this situation instead of letting Madison dictate how it should be handled. I could decide when and how to have the conversation with Mom. I could set the terms for any family discussions moving forward. I could stop being the accommodating younger sister and start being the older sister I had always actually been. For 23 years, I had lived according to other people's lies about who I was and what I was capable of. Starting tomorrow, I was going to find out who Jeanette Crawford really was when she stopped accepting other people's limitations and started making her own decisions about her life. The first decision was simple. When I went back to that hospital, it would be on my terms, not Madison. And this time, I wasn't leaving until I had gotten the full truth from both our parents about every aspect of this deception. Madison had spent 23 years being the older sister. It was time for her to find out what it felt like to be the younger one. I arrived at Cleveland General Hospital the next morning at precisely 9 a.m., deliberately choosing a time when I knew Madison would likely be at work. She had texted me the night before saying she was taking another day off to stay with our parents, but I was counting on her compulsive need to maintain professional appearances. Sure enough, when I checked with the ICU nurses, they confirmed that Madison had left around 8:30 a.m., promising to return during her lunch break. Mom was in a private room on the 4th floor, awake but heavily sedated. When I knocked on her door and stepped inside, she turned her head slowly toward me, her eyes taking a moment to focus. A large bandage covered the left side of her head, and various monitors tracked her vital signs with steady electronic beeping.
"Jeanette, sweetheart," she said, her voice weak but unmistakably relieved. "I was so worried when the nurses said you hadn't been here yet today. Are you okay? Is Madison okay?" The immediate maternal concern in her voice almost broke my resolve. This was the woman who had comforted me through childhood nightmares, celebrated my small victories, and supported me through every disappointment and setback of my young adult life. But this was also the woman who had orchestrated the most fundamental deception of my existence. "We're both fine, Mom," I said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "But we need to talk about something important, something Madison and I discovered yesterday while we were looking for your medical records." I watched her face carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign that she knew what was coming. Unlike Dad's immediate panic when I had mentioned the birth certificates, Mom's expression remained neutral, though I noticed her fingers tightening slightly on the hospital blanket. "What kind of something?" she asked, her tone carefully casual in a way that felt rehearsed. Instead of answering immediately, I pulled out our birth certificates and placed them on the rolling table beside her bed, positioning them so she could clearly see both documents. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight widening of her eyes, a barely perceptible intake of breath, a moment of absolute stillness before she looked back up at me. "I know what these say, Jeanette," she said, quietly, "and I assume you and Madison have questions about why the Bates don't match what we've always told you."
Her calm acknowledgement was somehow more unsettling than Dad's panic had been. At least his reaction had felt genuine, emotional, human. Mom's response felt calculated, as if she had been preparing for this conversation for years and had already decided how she would handle it. "Questions?" I said, hearing my voice rise despite my efforts to stay controlled. "Mom, these documents show that Madison and I are twins and that I was born first. This isn't about having questions. This is about discovering that my entire life has been built on a lie." Mom closed her eyes and was quiet for a long moment. When she opened them again, there was a sadness there that looked older than her physical injuries, deeper than the trauma of the car accident. "We did what we thought was best for both of you," she said, using almost the exact same words Dad had used the day before. "I know it's hard to understand now, but we were trying to protect Madison and give her the best possible start in life. What about giving me the best possible start in life? What about protecting me from feeling inadequate and insecure for 23 years because I thought I was the younger, less capable sister? You were always so strong, Janeth. Even as a baby, you were independent and confident. You didn't need the same kind of support that Madison needed." The familiar refrain was infuriating. Throughout this entire revelation, both parents had used my supposed strength as justification for their deception, as if being naturally confident meant I didn't deserve honesty or respect. As if my resilience gave them permission to steal my birthright and give it to my sister. "That wasn't your decision to make," I said firmly. "You had no right to decide which daughter needed advantages more, or which one could handle being lied to better. You had no right to change our birth order to suit your ideas about what would be best for Madison's self-esteem." Mom struggled to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, wincing as the movement aggravated her injuries. "Janeth, you don't understand how difficult those first few years were. Madison almost died during delivery, and then she had developmental delays that worried us constantly. She was so fragile, so fearful of everything. When we saw how much more confident you were, how easily you adapted to new situations, we thought—" "You thought what? That making her the older sister would magically solve her problems? That lying to both of us for our entire lives was somehow better than getting Madison appropriate help for whatever she was struggling with?" "We did get her help," Mom said defensively. "We had her evaluated by specialists, worked with early intervention programs, and did everything the doctors recommended. But none of that addressed the social dynamics between you two. You were always the leader, even as toddlers. You would make decisions for both of you, take charge in playgroups, speak up when Madison was too shy. We were afraid that if people knew you were the older twin, Madison would never develop her own voice." This was a new piece of information, and it hit me like a physical blow. According to Mom, I had been the natural leader even when we were small children, even when everyone believed Madison was older. My leadership instincts had been so strong that our parents felt the need to actively suppress them in order to give Madison space to develop confidence. "So you decided to reverse our roles," I said, the full scope of their manipulation finally becoming clear. "You saw that I was naturally more assertive and confident, and instead of celebrating that or helping Madison find her own strengths, you decided to give me my advantages and force me into a subordinate position. We didn't force you into anything. We just adjusted the external circumstances to level the playing field. We thought if Madison had the social expectation of being the older sister, she would rise to meet those expectations."
And you thought if I had the social expectation of being the younger sister, I would what? Just accept being diminished? Just quietly shrink myself to make room for Madison's artificially boosted confidence? Mom was crying now, tears streaming down her face and dampening the hospital pillow. "We thought you were strong enough to handle it. We thought it wouldn't change who you fundamentally were." "But it did change who I was," I said, standing up and beginning to pace around the small room. "Every day for 23 years, I second-guessed myself because I thought Madison had more experience and wisdom. I chose easier paths because I thought I wasn't ready for the challenges she could handle. I accepted less than I deserved because I thought being younger meant I needed to be more patient and understanding. The monitors around Mom's bed were beeping faster now, and I could see her blood pressure readings climbing on the display screen. Part of me felt guilty about causing additional stress while she was recovering from a serious head injury, but a larger part of me was tired of being the one who always worried about everyone else's comfort and well-being. Do you have any idea what it's like to discover that your entire sense of self was built on a lie? I continued. Do you understand that I've spent my whole life believing I was less important, less capable, less deserving of respect than my sister? And now I find out that wasn't just wrong, it was the complete opposite of the truth. Janeth, please, Mom said, reaching toward me with a shaking hand. I know we made mistakes. I know we hurt you in ways we never intended, but you have to understand that we were young parents dealing with an impossible situation. We were trying to do what was best for both our daughters. No, I said, stepping back from her reaching hand. You were trying to do what was easiest for Madison, regardless of what it cost me. And now you're trying to make this about your good intentions instead of taking responsibility for the damage you caused. A soft knock on the door interrupted our conversation, and Madison stepped into the room, clearly having arrived early from work. She looked back and forth between Mom and me, taking in the tense atmosphere and the elevated readings on the medical monitors. "What's going on here?" she asked, immediately moving to Mom's bedside with the same protective instincts she had shown with Dad the day before. "Janeth, Mom just woke up yesterday. She needs rest, not stress." And there it was, Madison once again positioning herself as the responsible, caring daughter while implying that I was being selfish and inconsiderate. Even now, in the face of everything we had discovered, she was still playing the role of the mature, older sister who needed to manage her impulsive younger sibling. "Actually, Madison," I said, turning to face her directly, "Mom has been awake long enough to confirm everything Dad told us yesterday. She's been awake long enough to admit that they deliberately lied to us about our birth order for 23 years. And she's been awake long enough to explain that they did it specifically to give you advantages that belonged to me." Madison's face went pale as she looked from me to Mom and back again. "Janeth, please don't do this now. Can't you see that she's hurt and scared? This conversation can wait until she's stronger." And there it was, Madison once again positioning herself as the responsible, caring daughter while implying that I was being selfish and inconsiderate. Even now, in the face of everything we had discovered, she was still playing the role of the mature older sister who needed to manage her impulsive younger sibling. "Actually, Madison," I said, turning to face her directly, "Mom has been awake long enough to confirm everything Dad told us yesterday. She's been awake long enough to admit that they deliberately lied to us about our birth order for 23 years. And she's been awake long enough to explain that they did it specifically to give you advantages that belonged to me." Madison's face went pale as she looked from me to Mom and back again. "Janeth, please don't do this now. Can't you see that she's hurt and scared? This conversation can wait until she's stronger." "No, it can't wait," I said. "I've waited 23 years to have this conversation, and I'm not waiting anymore just because it makes you uncomfortable." For the first time in our lives, I was refusing to defer to Madison's judgment about timing, appropriateness, or family harmony. And judging by the shocked expression on her face, she was finally beginning to understand that everything between us was about to change. The silence that followed my declaration stretched for what felt like an eternity. Madison stood frozen beside Mom's hospital bed, her hand still reaching toward the blanket she had been about to adjust, while Mom stared at me with an expression that mixed fear, guilt, and something that might have been pride. "Janeth," Madison said, finally, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it, "I understand you're angry, but taking it out on Mom while she's recovering isn't going to solve anything." "I'm not taking anything out on anyone," I replied, my voice steady and calm in a way that felt foreign but powerful. "I'm having an honest conversation with our mother about the choices she made that affected my entire life, something that should have happened decades ago."
Madison looked to Mom for support, but Mom had closed her eyes and turned her face toward the window, effectively removing herself from the conflict between her daughters. For the first time in our lives, Madison was going to have to handle a confrontation with me without parental backup or intervention. "What do you want from us, Janeth?" Madison asked, and I could hear genuine confusion in her voice. What's done is done. We can't change the past, and fighting about it isn't going to help anyone move forward. The question revealed everything I needed to know about how fundamentally different our perspectives had become. Madison was still thinking in terms of managing the situation, finding a way to smooth over the family discord and return to some version of normal. She couldn't conceive of the possibility that I might not want to move forward on her terms, or that the relationship between us might be permanently altered by these revelations.
What I want, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, is for you to understand that everything changes now. I want you to understand that I am not your younger sister who needs guidance and patience. I am your older sister who has spent 23 years being diminished and undermined by people who were supposed to love and support me. Madison's face crumpled as the full implications of my words hit her. Janeth, please, I never meant to diminish you. I honestly believed I was older. I honestly thought I was just being a good big sister by looking out for you. But you weren't just being a good big sister, I said, and for the first time, my voice carried the authority of someone who was finally claiming her rightful place. You were being a younger sister who was given privileges and respect that didn't belong to you. And now that we know the truth, continuing to accept those privileges would make you complicit in the deception. The words hung between us like a challenge, and I watched Madison struggle with the reality of what I was proposing. For 23 years, she had built her identity around being the responsible, mature, older sibling. Her confidence, her career success, her relationships, everything was connected to the persona she had developed based on that false foundation. "So, what are you suggesting?" Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That we just flip everything around and pretend the last 23 years never happened? I'm suggesting that we start telling the truth, I said. I'm suggesting that when people ask about our family, we tell them that we're twins and I was born first. I'm suggesting that when we're in social situations, you stop automatically taking charge and making decisions for both of us. I'm suggesting that you acknowledge that any advantages you've had in life might have been influenced by people believing you were older and more mature than you actually were. Madison was crying openly now, but these weren't the manipulative tears she had used in childhood to get her way, or the performance tears she deployed when she wanted sympathy. These were the raw, ugly tears of someone whose entire sense of self was being challenged and found wanting. "I don't know how to be the younger sister," she said through her sobs. "I don't know how to not be the one who takes care of things and makes sure everyone is okay." "Then maybe it's time you learned," I said. And I realized that for the first time in our relationship, I was the one offering guidance and wisdom. Maybe it's time you found out who Madison Crawford really is when she's not playing a role that was assigned to her by parents who thought she needed artificial advantages to succeed. Mom opened her eyes and looked between us, her face pale and drawn but alert. "Girls, please, don't let this destroy your relationship with each other. Whatever mistakes your father and I made, you two have always been close. You've always loved and supported each other." "Have we?" I asked, turning my attention back to Mom. "Or have we had a relationship based on false premises, where one person was given authority she didn't earn and the other was forced into submission she didn't deserve? How do we know what our real relationship might have been if it had been built on truth instead of lies?" The question seemed to exhaust Mom completely, and she sank back into her pillows with a look of defeat. "I don't know how to answer that, Janeth. I don't know how to fix this." "You can't fix it," I said simply. "The damage is done, and we all have to live with the consequences. But what you can do is stop trying to manage my reaction to your betrayal. What you can do is accept that I have every right to be angry, and that my anger doesn't make me unreasonable or difficult."
I gathered up our birth certificates from the rolling table beside Mom's bed and put them back in my purse. These documents had been hidden in our father's filing cabinet for over 2 decades, but from now on, they were going to be my constant reminder of who I really was. "I'm going to leave now," I announced, and both Mom and Madison looked startled by my sudden decision. I need time to process all of this, and I need space to figure out how I want to rebuild my life now that I know the truth. "Janeth, wait," Madison said, reaching toward me with the same desperate gesture Mom had used earlier. "We need to talk about this more. We need to figure out how to move forward as a family." "We will talk about it," I said, stopping at the door but not turning around. "But when we do, it's going to be a conversation between equals, not a family meeting where the older sister makes decisions for everyone else. Because I am the older sister, Madison. I always was, and from now on, that's how I'm going to live my life." 6 months later, I was sitting in my new apartment, a spacious one-bedroom in a trendy neighborhood that I could afford thanks to the promotion I had finally asked for and received. The walls were decorated with artwork I had chosen for myself, without consulting Madison about whether she thought my taste was appropriate or mature enough. The kitchen was stocked with food I liked, not just things that Madison had recommended during our weekly grocery shopping trips. My phone buzzed with a text message from Madison, the first one she had sent in 3 weeks. We had been working with a family therapist to rebuild our relationship on honest foundations, but the process was slow and often painful. Madison was struggling to not being the decision-maker in our family dynamic, while I was still learning to trust my own judgment after decades of deferring to her supposed wisdom. "Would you like to have lunch this weekend?" the text read. "I found a new restaurant I thought you might like, but you can choose if you'd prefer somewhere else."
The small acknowledgement that I should have equal say in our plans might seem insignificant to outside observers, but for us, it represented a fundamental shift in how we related to each other. Madison was slowly learning to ask instead of assume, to suggest instead of decide, to respect my opinions instead of dismissing them as the uninformed preferences of a younger sister. I typed back, "Saturday at 1 p.m. works for me. Send me a few options and I'll pick one." As I hit send, I reflected on how different my life had become since that morning in the hospital, when I had finally claimed my rightful place as the older sister. I had switched to a more challenging position at work, started dating someone who treated me as an equal rather than someone who needed guidance, and most importantly, learned to trust my own instincts and judgment. The truth had been painful and devastating, but it had also been liberating. For the first time in my life, I was living as Janeth Crawford, the older sister, the firstborn, the one who had always been strong enough to lead but had been forced to follow. My parents and I were still working through the complex process of rebuilding trust, but I had made it clear that any relationship moving forward would be based on complete honesty and mutual respect. There would be no more lies designed to protect me from difficult truths, and no more decisions made about my life without my input. Madison and I might never have the easy, comfortable relationship we had before, but we were slowly building something more authentic and equal. She was learning to value my opinions and insights, while I was learning to offer support without automatically deferring to her judgment. The birth certificates that had revealed our family's deepest secret now sat framed on my desk, not as a symbol of betrayal, but as a reminder that truth, however painful, was always better than the most comfortable lie. I was 23 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly who I was supposed to be. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.